Hello, and welcome to another Sunday Superversive live stream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler, and today I am with James Pyles, an author friend of both me and Anthony's, who we've crossed quite a few times. I'm also here with Anthony Marchetta, my usual co host. James, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing terrific. How are you guys doing?
Fantastic. Certainly better than there's a video we're watching about Garfield, and we're certainly doing better than John Arbuckle
Yep.
at any given day. Thank the
Oh, okay.
Lord.
All right. Well, this is your show, and I don't get interviewed very often, so I'm going to let you kind of guide me through what we need to do.
Sure thing. So, the biggest thing right now is to sort of describe yourself and the sort of things you write and get up to. I know you wrote the Pleiades dilemma in the Soul Planetary Anthology.
Yes, I did. That was actually one of my earlier stories, and it was a lot of fun. They're all a lot of fun, but I've been a published author for a little over 20 years, but they've all been like IT textbooks. And so I've only really done fiction for the last 2 or 3 years, which is a very different kind of writing. Um, and one of the things I learned about myself as an author is that once I get done with the story, I'm kind of ready to move on.
Mm.
And it, with textbooks, you get sometimes even years later, you get erotic questions about, what about this, what about that, and I read them and I think I don't even remember what I was thinking about when I did that. So when I wrote the Pleiades dilemma, I was kind of in a certain space and I presented it for publication, and then the planetary anthology has a very interesting history. It sort of kind of went away for a while, and by the time it came back and people were interested in publishing the story, I thought I am a very different person now than I was then. So I really needed to rewrite it, and even now I'm kind of not as satisfied as I could be. So I'm always looking towards kind of the next project.
Mm.
Stretching myself and going in a different direction. Um, I don't know that I don't know if you've ever had that experience with your stories, whether you kind of always love them or you realize that at some point you're just kind of ready to not be with them anymore. Um,
Right, right.
um, but I've got some stories that I'm promoting now that are very interesting. At least I think so. And obviously, I'm prejudiced. Normally, what I do as a fiction writer is I will respond to any number of open submission calls um, that I find that are interesting. And so, for the vast majority of my 2 or 3 year career as a fiction writer, um, I've been working through a number of indie publishers, but I had a story I really wanted to get published, and no one was buying it. No one was buying it. No one was buying it. So I thought, what in the world am I doing? Let me go ahead and just self-publish and see what happens. And so I self-published a story called Ice. It's actually my second novella, and I've written a number of different versions of the story depending on who I was trying to sell it to. Some of it was purely scientific. Some of it was purely magical. Some of it was a mix of the two, of varying word counts. But the idea I would be to turn what we think of as climate change kind of completely on its head. Right now, a lot of people are worried about how hot things are going to get and worried about things melting and all that sort of stuff. I thought, what if we just skipped all of that? We went thousands of years in the future. All of the ice, 100% of it has melted, um, and society has changed. I tinkered a lot with the technology. I wanted to create something that was more kind of 17th to 18th century, um, sailing ships, and just for giggles, because I added a lot of magic in there, I brought back the dinosaurs. And I said, what would happen if people were afraid of an ice age? And it was a big mystery, it was a big conspiracy that, it was a big cover up for this sort of thing, and people were dying, and um, and freaking out over all of this because people had gotten, and I had actually done the research. People could actually really live when it's hotter, and there's a lot more CO2 in the air, so it's not completely unreasonable. And then how would people react? And just because it was fun, I actually had a dream about my character's backstory. I didn't realize at the time. I very rarely dream about things I can actually put into motion in a story. But with Kimun Yong, the captain of my sailing ship, um, I actually did dream about him and how he was conscripted into the army and how he found this particular type of magical technology, um, and merged that with the real life story of a 19th century female Chinese pirate, um, who really did exist and commanded about 1,800 different ships with 80,000 men at the beginning of the 19th century, and just had a lot of fun playing with all of that, writing my pirate story, and it was a lot of fun. Now, the hard part about being an indie publisher and doing your own stuff is, of course, getting some sort of traction, which is one of the reasons why I would like your help with this one. I've sent you the links, and
I've linked it in chat for those interested. It is.
great.
It does look good. Like I'm not much of a hard sci-fi guy, or at least ones with as much technical detail as you lavish in. But that one
Hmm.
absolutely gripped me from just the cover. Like,
Uh-huh.
forget the description, right? That cover was an absolute fantastic cover. Like, I am buying this based on the cover alone. It's a
Thank
ice
you.
giant in the thing, because like don't judge a book by your cover. No.
No, yeah, and I totally agree. It's like, you look at the cover and go, that's interesting. And I had a heck of a time finding a cover that would really map to the story. And when I saw this one, and I saw that like it basically was available at reasonable prices, I thought, wow, I'm going with this, because this very much tells the story, although hopefully not in a spoiler kind of way, about what's going to happen to these people. And yeah, it was a lot of fun. I, I I hope that people will start reading this. I have no illusions about becoming, like the next Stephen King, being rich and famous and all that. But it's the idea that, I've created something out of my personality, and it would be gratifying if people just, some people just read it and told me what they thought.
Oh, and it looks great. I like your description. I like the cover. The best part about it, but it's
Hmm.
that's an important thing. With a lot of authors, uh, some of them take too much into it. Some people take too little. But in reality, it's like, are you, um, putting lavishing your effort into it, whether or
Hmm.
not you have a publisher? And it looks good.
Yeah. Yeah, and like I said, normally I like working with indie publishers. In this particular case, nobody was giving me a nibble. Um, and I've got a lot of stories like that where I've written for a particular submission and the original publisher wasn't interested. And then I would submit it 2, 3, 4 different times to different people, and eventually someone would pick it up. In this case, it wasn't happening. And I just liked the concept. I mean,
Mm,
um, I'm obviously too close to my own stories to see them objectively. So that's really what I'm looking for, is the idea that, is this really a good story? Because at the end of the day, it's really what I want to produce, is just good storytelling.
right.
I don't have a particular agenda, so to speak, or idea or philosophy that I'm trying to sell. It's the idea that I want to entertain.
Oh yeah, and that's rare enough these days, anyway.
Yeah,
Um,
unfortunately, that's true. And as I've been discovering, it's an interesting thing that as you become a fiction writer, at least from my perspective, and I don't know anybody else's point of view, but you enter this very political realm, where people are very invested in only certain ideas moving forward and being exposed. And I thought, well, wait a minute. This is not how I was brought up.
hmm,
I'm 67 years old. Um, the 1960s and 1970s were my era for fiction. Star Trek, Outer Limits, Twilight Zone,
Right,
and,
right.
and going forward, old school DC and Marvel comics, the so-called Silver Age. The idea is that adventure is fun, and it's exciting and it's interesting. But I don't anymore. It's a lot like people are kind of selling a product, and not necessarily in a good way.
Right.
So, and in my writing, what I want to do is I kind of want to go back to that, which means it's not going to appeal to everyone, but to go to
Hmm.
the idea that I'm just writing an adventure story because it's fun, and it's exciting and it's different, and it's something that people maybe aren't used to anymore.
Oh yeah. And
So
there's gradients to it. Like, I don't make I make it very explicit that, Pinkerton's Ghost is eventually a for profit exercise, but at no point do I say to myself, I will choose money over good storytelling. Is it more
right.
important that I suck up to something to get that ticket, or is it more important I use, my God given skill to,
Mm,
properly entertain the masses, or, create you know, put down some remind people that the bad guys aren't going to win in the end.
right. Exactly. And it's although to be fair, I like writing bad guys as well as good guys. In
Right.
in ice there really isn't a bad human being per se. It's these are elemental forces that are being acted upon uh, on our planet. But it's how people respond to that. The idea that history is changing, that our fundamental lifestyle is going away, and there's nothing we can do about it. Um, and so how it is, it's really the passing of the baton from one generation to the next, because we have our older characters, spoiler alert, passing away, and then the newer characters are going to have to live in a world that no one has seen for thousands of years. Um, and how they will adapt to it. And now in
That's
proper fashion. I'm sorry, go ahead.
certainly a story for our modern experience.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, that life is change, and your world isn't going to, be the way that you want it to be forever. And I'm very attached to the world of my past, but I have to admit to myself that, I don't get to have my way all the time. um, but I get to write about it, which is a lot of fun. It actually goes into my next product, which I sent you a link for.
Hmm.
Times Abyss was published by Black Hair Press, hair like bunny rabbits, not on your head. Um, and they're a small Australian indie publisher. And they had a project called Underground. Basically, okay, give us a novella, and the only real condition is that some portion of it that's significant has to occur underground. Where I had written a story in various incarnations, of course. Again, it's one of my earlier concepts. I'd written it originally for another Australian production, a military sci-fi periodical, and they didn't want it, which is fine. Um, but you never throw anything away, because you never know who's going to want it. The idea, though, was that you have a device, an invention that, when activated, it's technically it's time travel, but it's not really. The idea is that it fractures time across the planet. That you create different zones in time, and depending, you could just go from one part of the earth to another, and you're in, from the 21st century, you go into, let's say, a dinosaur age, or you go into various other parts of the universe. um, but it's not just history, it's alternate reality. And so you have a scientist that created this thing basically at the behest of an arrogant billionaire who wanted to put this on his private island, and show off. Well, he doesn't he doesn't read the instructions, and so he creates a global disaster. And the inventor and 6 specialists are traveling to this island chain in the South Pacific. It's fictional. I made it up. It's somewhere between New Zealand and South America, um, to try to stop it. And the further they get into it, the more confusing it becomes. The irony is that each of the characters has a history with this device and with this creator and with these billionaires, but they remember it all differently because history has been changed for each one of them, and so they're kind of discovering themselves as well as this problem and trying to figure out how they're going to solve it. And it becomes more and more complicated as they get into it, because when you start monkeying with time and reality, anything is possible. Um, it's it's actually a homage, and I don't know if you have ever read any of Henri Norton's, or rather Alice Norton's works. When I was in junior high, I came across her novel, The Time Traders, and fell in love. Um, and so one of the things I do with ideas, I explore them on my blog, and so I'll write, basically fan fiction pieces or whatever, and I'll just monkey around with the reality of things, just to see how things turn out. And so that's really is what it was infused in Time's Abyss, without using any proprietary or material or things that belong to other people. Was the idea that time is incredibly fluid, but you need to explore the history of things, including aliens and dinosaurs. I love dinosaurs. This one also has dinosaurs, but they're very evolved. Um, to kind of to attempt to recreate, or at least limit, the disaster of this kind of temporal global catastrophe, where if you walk 10 feet in any direction, you're in a different different experience, with different rules. And the other thing I've done, I've created this novella, and I really was going to just end it there. At the end of the story, it's all over. But I hate writing stories that have definitive ends, and so it there's room for play. And one of the people who had reviewed it was said that he was excited to see what happens next, and so I started, almost against my will, plotting out the next chapter, if you will. And so I've got it plotted out, and basically, which would make about half a novel at this point. And then going forward, I would actually include the Ice universe in, uh, like, the third edition of Time's Abyss, because I don't like I said, I don't like throwing away anything. I think that my universes can coexist. Um,
Of
and
course, author multiverse theory.
Yeah, well, the multiverse that exists in my brain, and I've already done it actually. I created a time travel steampunky story, called Wayback, and I couldn't get it published, but I got a sequel, sort of, published. Actually, a couple of them in different anthologies, and so when Wayback was finally published, I realized I've got like 3 or 4 different pieces in the same universe, which is a lot of fun, um, because it's like I have 2 different time travel technologies, one that exists in the 19th century and one that exists in the far future, and they're basically in competition for which one is going to control the universe. They don't know that. They just think that anomalies are occurring, and so they're going back and forth and back and forth. And finally, the 19th century version wins, which means that everything going forward from the time of H.G. Wells, for example, is very different. Um, so I I like kind of connecting all of that together and making it kind of part of one big kind of thought experiment. Just because it's like, I mentioned before that sometimes when I write a story, I'm pretty much done with it. I want it to go away, but but there's this bigger picture of it that I kind of want to hang on to. I just want to express it differently.
I get you.
Hmm.
Megabuster Shepherd says, The adventure brings out the virtuous, the moral, and the spirit of masculinity. It is a high T genre, as in testosterone, that we need more of. I absolutely agree. Says something about Starman's son. Is that Andre Norton's or one of yours?
Andrew Norton's, well, Starman. So I'm not incredibly familiar with everything that she wrote. Um, I like the Time Traders series. I didn't discover until just a few years ago that it had extended across decades. I thought maybe there were two or three, four novels the one that I'd written, excuse me, wrote, read, but I thought that was it. And then I happened to be in the public library and saw one that was published just in the early 2000s. I mean, she didn't die that long ago, and she was writing in collaboration with someone else at that point. But
Hmm.
yeah, I don't. But the idea that we really need heroism in the world today, and not perfect people. I don't like writing perfect people. I like very much like writing flawed people because that's what we are. But the idea is that we're always trying to be better than we were. Um, and so between my captain in ice and my scientists and various other experts in time's abyss, they're all again striving for this ideal that we've got this big problem and we have to try to deal with it, and maybe we can't solve it, but you know we're going to confront it. We're not going to run away because we can't, because that's who we are as human beings. The idea is that we are who these kind of upset and sometimes flawed people, but we need to get better. Um, which just leads me to actually my third point for our conversation. I was normally, when I write, I'm responding to an open submission call, which means anybody can respond. Anyone can submit a story, as long as it fits the criteria.
Hmm.
Um, but in this particular case, it's oh yeah, it's Shadow Press, or excuse me, Cloak Press. I'm sorry. Um, the publisher there, again, another independent group, um, contacted me and invited me into a project that they were involved in. I'd had a number of stories published in their products before. They do spring into sci-fi and fall into fantasy, and now they've got a Winter or Wonder, which I just had a story accepted by them. Um, but Andrew Farrell, who's the publisher, had a shared universe idea that he had invited other of the authors that he likes to work with to become involved in, but he wanted more people, and so he emailed me and said, would you be interested? And basically, this is the universe I've created. These are the rules of the universe, and you can write a story as long as it adheres to the rules of the universe. And the universe is um, basically, since for thousands of years, these mysterious meteors have been falling on Earth, and unbeknownst to most of humanity, they have had extraordinary influences on both people and objects, and conferring to them really almost magical abilities. And at the same time, there is this organization that has risen up called the Collective that has been attempting to suppress knowledge of all of this. Um, and up until only recently, when there's been basically a gigantic meteor fall that no one could ignore, they've lost control. And so I actually have two stories published in this particular anthology, which is called Meteor Fall, and I sent you the link for that. And it's one of both of them are set, well, mainly in the 20th/21st century, but because this universe has existed for thousands of years, and then the Collective has been around for a long time, I'm thinking Knights Templar kind of thing as far as their history goes. You could really do a lot with it, and I love the concept of being able to work with other writers and to be able to collaborate on from our different perspectives on how we interject our imaginations into this universe. And it's very fascinating to me. It's not a super duper original idea, because I did the research and found that other people have had something similar going on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the but it's instead of having to depend 100% on my imagination to create a particular environment, someone else has basically handed me this idea. This is the environment that you're working in. Create something. And it's like, it sounded difficult at first, but it's like when I got into it, I thought, wow, this is really fascinating. Most of the characters I made up myself, but there were already pre-existing characters I could mine as long as I obeyed the rules that they were created by, and so I included them. Um, and it really goes the gambit from kind of superhuman creatures to, true artificial intelligence, um, and conspiracy theories, of course, because you have this dark, mysterious organization that has its own agenda to deal with this potential for really almost limitless power. Um, so that's that really captured me, and I'm hoping that if this particular anthology does take off, that I can just continue to create things in it, because it's really, you can go in any direction, um, because the scope of it is so vast. Um, and although I'm not a history expert, because it's got that scope that I can really just take it backwards in time as far as I want, or even forwards, um, and just to see what would happen with people when they're exposed to a force that can give them either everything they want or everything that they dreaded.
Sounds good. So
Hmm.
you said you do a lot of things on sort of like not off the cuff, but like with how do I want to put say it, like to the anthology that you're submitting to. What sort
Well,
of goes? What goes through your mind when you take up those projects?
okay, I'm getting some feedback here to where I'm hearing myself.
Uh, unless you have something open.
Okay,
I'm not
okay,
seeing
hang on a
anything
second,
on
because
my
I'm
end.
getting.
Is it stuff from the past conversation?
I had too many tabs open, so I've closed everything out, and hopefully that'll solve the problem. Um, now, you asked me a question, and because of the multiple kind of different expressions, I missed it. So could you repeat it, please?
Sure. So you seem to do a lot of stuff to suit the situation or the publisher that you're in. What
Hmm.
sort of mindset do you take going into that?
It's um, well, I'll look at a list of these various open submissions and cull out the ones that just don't seem to fit me for whatever reason. And then it's just a matter of whatever attracts me. So, okay, you want this story between, this particular word count. It has to do with alternate histories or time travel, that sort of thing. And anymore, the first thing I'll do is I'll take a look at what I've already written to see if I've got something on tap that I can submit, and that's worked out fairly well. Um, the other part is just it's a lot of times it's really just whatever is on my mind at the moment, whatever I'm interested in, whatever I'm kind of passionate about. So it's a combination of where I am as a human being, where I am as a writer, and whatever their requirements are. So if I were to have gotten that submission notice 1 year ago or 1 year from now, whatever I would try to prepare for it would be different because I would be different. So it's not just it's not a concrete thing. It's a very
Mm,
difficult question to answer because it just really depends on where my head is at the time.
I understand.
Um, but as I mentioned, like I'm very old school in terms of my science fiction. I like the old stories better than a lot of the new ones. Although I'm having a great deal of fun reading the Expanse novels. I've never seen the television show, but the writing is pretty good, and it's an interesting adventure. Um, but I think a lot of the message has been lost in science fiction and fantasy. That and I've mentioned this before, is that the idea that it's not it, it, it's true that all fiction does have a message, and sometimes the author is presenting their idea. I mean, Gene Roddenberry in Star Trek, he obviously had an idea of what he wanted to do. He was trying to present things going what the future he thought would be like, and so we tend to do that. But there's this idea anymore that the message or the politics or the social impotence, if you will, is more important than telling a good story, and that's where I draw the line. I thought if I could do nothing else, I want to tell a good story.
Right.
You know, that someone will be entertained by. They'll think it's cool. They'll think it's fun. It'll take an hour out of their life. That will be very more interesting. Whatever, um, but just to be to say something to people that they'll enjoy, and that you can talk about. Um, it's one of the things about being an author is that you don't really get to, always to talk to the people who are reading your tales and to find out what they really think, except maybe if they review it or something. But it is to
Mm,
have an exchange. And even when you're writing a story and it's just you pounding at a keyboard and creating something and doing tons and tons of editing, um, to where you think it's going to be interesting, and then pushing it out the door at a publisher or publishing it yourself.
mm,
um, you really I really would like to say, what did you think about that? I mean, because
right.
yeah, because I'm blind to my own process. I mean, can't see outside of myself. um, I think it's a good story, but to somebody else. So
Right.
please, yeah, go ahead.
Just to talk about the Soul anthology series.
Mhm.
I got in, like, I didn't have many because people don't this was kind of very late in the game for the planetary anthology series, and
Right,
everyone was super hype about like Luna and Pluto and Earth and Mars. So it's
right.
like Soul. Sure, it's 99 or 98% of the mass in the solar system, but it got maybe 1% of the attention.
Well,
Um,
yeah, because it's hard to write for Saul. I mean,
yeah,
it's the sun. I mean, it's easy to write. Oh, okay, I'm going to write about the planet Mars because everybody writes about the planet Mars and
I wrote about
colonization and yada
Mars. Yeah,
yada.
yeah.
Yeah, and so did I. In fact, what was it? Richard awarded me a the Helicon Award for best short story in that particular anthology, which I was not I never saw that one coming. Um,
Nice.
but
Congratulations.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, 3 billion year the 3 billion year love. I
Mm,
actually wrote that because I was feeling very antisocial at the time, and I wanted to go someplace where people couldn't reach me, and so I created a story about a person who had tragically lost his wife. He's again a inventor, brilliant um, billionaire who inadvertently found a gateway to Mars, but Mars of the distant past, 3 billion years ago, when it had an atmosphere and an ocean. And he, through that entire process of being able to translate himself there, he found a resolution to his own kind of anguish. And again, it was very interesting. Sort of thing. I love doing the research for for these stories to kind of look up things like when I was doing ice and finding that National Geographic had created a whole bunch of maps of what the world would look like at different sections of the globe if all the ice melted, and looking at the different coastlines and such, and which drove a lot of the characters, because you had one of my characters was from basically Pine Bluff, Arkansas, but it's at the end of a gigantic bay from sunken New Orleans in Houston. Um, so it's like, if our world is that different, what does it do to people? And if you go back in time with Mars, I mean, one of the things that always I loved, but the first science fiction I ever wrote was Edgar Rice read Edgar Rice Burroughs' Princess of Mars when I was 9 years old. But as I got older, much as I loved it, it bugged me as the idea that that wouldn't actually really work. Well, he was writing starting at least in the early 20th century, and so we didn't really know very much about Mars at that point, and so he could really write and say anything, and there's no one to refute him. But as we go forward in time, that we realized it couldn't work that way unless that was very, very far in the past, which he didn't address, which is fine. But I decided, okay, I'm going to fix that. I'm going to go back, and if we go back far enough in time, then yes, we can tell stories about Mars or Venus or whatever, that because they're so far backwards in time, that we can interact with, and it could be more human friendly, or we can project human beings back there in an environment that they would at least potentially be able to survive in, that today they would not. And as a big fan of not only science fiction, but
Are you still there?
I don't hear him. Oh no. I tend to assume when this happens it's on my end, but not this time.
You got this.
acting, this is often caused by unstable internet connection. I'm getting a message here.
Here we
So
go.
There you are.
Yep.
here I am. Great, perfect. What I was saying is that sometimes my rationality overwhelms my imagination, in the sense that I realize that things are very, very bad for people in space. One is radiation, the other is microgravity. And until we solve those problems, maybe using more than handwavium, we're not really going to get to the science fiction part of our lives where it becomes science fact. Which is tremendously disappointing to me, because I was promised my big wheelie space stations and my moon bases and my Mars colony when I was 14 years old, and they haven't delivered yet.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so
But in fiction, we can always have them.
and that's and that's the beauty of it, is that okay, I can write a fictional story about that. I have three grandchildren. One is my 12-year-old grandson, and he and I play and since he was about 5 years old, we played basically a verbal role-playing game, where we'll create an environment, we'll create characters, and then we'll just talk, and we'll interact and have this adventure together. And it changes over time, and as he's gotten older, it's become more sophisticated. But the thing I've been trying to explain to him is that even in fiction, there are rules. You can't just say crazy stuff and pretend it happens. Okay, how does Superman fly? Well, beats me. He shouldn't. But because he's such a beloved character and he's been around for so long, we just pretend that it's not a problem. However, if I'm writing something new, it's a problem. I create this situation. Well, how do I, how does that work? And it drives me crazy sometimes, because maybe this is your experience in writing and maybe it's not, but my experience of writing is that I have an idea and I write and I start getting into it and realize it's terrible, it's crud, it's awful. But but experience has shown me is that the only thing you really need to do, but the first thing you need to do, is to finish it. It doesn't matter matter how bad it is. Finish your first draft, and then you go back, and sometimes it will take me much, much longer to edit something than it did to originally write it, because then I'm going over and over and thinking about all the logical fallacies and all the problems and all the issues. And that shouldn't work that way. It should work something, yeah, it should do something else. Um, but that's the challenge of fiction. And I think it's the thing that people who don't write don't really get,
Mm.
is that you just can't make stuff up. It has to be credible in some fashion. Yes, of course, this is suspension of disbelief, because things don't travel faster than light, as far as we know. Time travel doesn't exist, as far as we know. I mean, there are limits in our practical universe that we're setting aside when we create this thing, but it still has to be a believable universe. Otherwise, people are going to look at it and say, "Nah, I'm not having that." Um, it's like I read comic strips in the morning to wake up. And right now in Tarzan, we
Like
have
Garfield.
well, no, no, actually I do read Garfield, but there's a Tarzan strip from 1971 that was drawn and written by Russ Manning, who did the early Magnus robot fighter 4000 AD, which was terrific artwork, and I loved it in the early 1960s. But anyway, he's the idea of Tarzan and going to the center of the earth and meeting pterodactyls and all this sort of stuff, and there being a sun in the center of the earth and it being hollow. All of that stuff is, I mean, when Burroughs created it, he was writing for 12-year-old boys. I get that, but as adults, the only way you can love that and read it and not just like turn your nose up is to tap into the nostalgia of it.
Right.
But that's the only way to do it. If I were to try to sell that to my 12-year-old grandson, he just laughs and says that's impossible, because he doesn't have that same emotional connection.
I
And so
mean,
the only, yeah.
like for me, it's like I read that as a kid, and then it's like, no, I don't
Hmm.
care whether this is real or not. Pellucidar, is a perfectly acceptable way to have for something to be in the center of our Earth.
Hmm.
No problems. But then again, it's I also read Redwall and quite a few others as a child, so it's I don't
Hmm.
know, maybe I'm a little bit biased.
Well, I think that's what nostalgia does to us. So it biases us towards, loving something that doesn't make any sort of sense, because it was fun when we were kids, and now it's fun when we're adults. But if you try to sell it to the next generation, and that's one of the problems, I think, with fiction, is that you have to pay more attention to the fact that y- you know people are more aware of the universe than they ever were before, just because information is so much more easily accessible thanks to the internet. um, things that I would have to go to a library and look up in an encyclopedia when I was 12 are now a 5-second Google search. um, so it challenges us as writers of fiction to say, okay, I can't just write what I feel like writing. I have to write something that really makes sense. And unless I use a lot of even systems of magic, still have to be systems. I mean, they
Hmm.
still have to make internal sense. I remember reading an interview with Orson Scott Card from over 20 years ago now, and it was one of the really a piece of information that you don't see very much, because Card is a religious person. So he talked about spirituality as a key component in the life of a fictional characters, and it's something you don't really see very much unless
Hmm.
it's, of course, really super magical fictional spirituality. But what if your character is a Christian? What if your character is a Jewish person? What would that look like? You can't just ignore that. And in fact,
Right.
yeah,
Like
one of the
something that always bothered me is like, listen, you've got elves and vampires and all these other stuff, like, and they recoil at the sign of the cross, and it's like, why aren't you a Christian if they're
uh-huh,
freaking out whenever you mention Jesus Christ? And it's like,
uh-huh,
yeah, I don't believe in a God. I'm an atheist. Something, blah blah blah, Darwin something, and it's like, That's not
Right.
logical. Like, you might be saying something fairy is not logical, and I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the straw man I
Right.
developed. But it's
Right.
like, no, at a certain point you just have to say, you know, if Oberon recoils and shrieks and bleeds when, the name of Christ is mentioned, I think there might be something that your character should realize and not just
Hmm.
be like, wow, this is weird and random. I don't think this will ever come up again.
Well,
Excuse me.
the thing is, you can't and as you pointed out very rightly, so you can't have a vampire afraid of the cross or afraid of Christ without the reality of that in the universe.
Right?
Otherwise, so what? They just, oh, you've got a piece of wood there. That's nice. Um, so what? Or holy water or whatever. I
Yeah.
did actually. I did write a vampire piece just because I could, but it was part of a larger universe. I wanted to explore the idea: what if a devout Christian were made into a vampire? Now, it depends on your belief about what causes vampirism.
Hmm.
If it's purely supernatural, then his soul is corrupted, and that's the end of it. But what if it's biological? What if? But it does have spiritual components, and that you have this individual who's cursed with vampirism, but he still has this longing to return to uh, return to God.
Hmm.
But he can't because he's prevented by this force that's become part of him. Um, and it's one of those things that I wanted to turn to a novel, but it's so incredibly complicated to act out that it's still sitting as a potential in various different stories in my blog and in my imagination, but that's it. But the idea of you have this incredibly conflicted individual um, who's been infected by this evil force, but still is striving to become truer, and there's no apparent resolution, and he's left behind a wife and children.
Hmm.
um, what do you do with that? And I think the reason that's so attractive to me is that in a much hopefully lesser sense, it's really who we are as human beings and as believers, as Christians, is that we've got this ideal that we're striving for, but we're never really going to be that person.
Right.
It's always a goal. It's always out there, and it's why we have Christ. That's why we're forgiven. Is because it's not what we do. I mean, it is what we do. We can't just do anything we want. Paul was very clear about that in Romans.
Hmm.
Um, but it's not something that we can actually work for either, and so it's a struggle within each of us as human beings, as individuals. And even if you're an atheist, or regardless of your necessarily your spiritual religious orientation, for lack of a better word, is that everybody has this ideal of what they think of as good. Now, we disagree about that a lot as human
Hmm.
beings. What you think is good and what I think is good may be very different. But we all want to be good. I mean, nobody is a villain in his own story, and those are the stories I really, really like. Is the idea that we could be perceived of as evil by other people, but we don't see ourselves that way. We have reasons for the things that we do, even if they're horrific. Um, so that's why it's fun to write both bad guys and good guys, is because the bad guy, ideally, if you write that person well, doesn't they don't see themselves as bad. They see themselves as, I'm doing this for a reason. And those are the best bad guys to really kind of interact with. Um, and to try, and in the end, of course, they have to have a fall, because you have to have a morality, or at least I have to have a morality in the stories that I write.
Oh, absolutely.
That yeah, that says that there are certain
You
lines you
know,
just don't cross.
Hmm.
it's interesting that you say that everybody is always searching to do good, because it's actually something that Thomas Aquinas famously said,
Uh huh.
and one of his most famously misunderstood comments. He said that everybody is seeking the good, like that everybody is looking for good, and everybody misunderstands this, of course. people are very quick to say, well, that's clearly not true. People try and do things that they know are wrong all the time. Isn't that what sin is? And that's true, but that's not really what Aquinas is saying. What Aquinas is actually saying is that everybody, when they make a decision, is making that decision because they believe in that moment it's the best decision. So they believe, nobody is doing something because they think it's the wrong that they think is the wrong thing to do. They're always making it even if it's wrong. People, when they make that decision, feel as if they're forced into a box, right? You feel like you have no way out. This is the only thing that I could do. And that's the danger of sin, right? It's so easy to say, I'm not a bad person. I wouldn't have done this. I only did this because of X, Y, or Z. And then how far down the slope do you slide? Now, eventually, when you get true villains, people who have slid all the way down the slope, they're people who just don't really care anymore, right? Like, that's why, a villain is the hero in his own story, I think, is sometimes true, but sometimes I think there is a point where you go so far down the slope that eventually it just turns into, I no longer care if what I'm doing is good or bad. And that's where you get true, real, like, black-hearted people. But I think all of us are sinners here, right? The whole,
Yeah.
this is perfectly biblical. We're all sinners, and all of us who are sinners, we all do. If you asked us if we were bad people, I think that while everybody will intellectually here could say, "Yeah, no, I know I'm not a good person." In reality, when you're making those choices, you're trying to justify it, right? You're always trying to justify it because you're not doing it because you're trying to be a bad person. You're doing it because you don't see the way out at the time.
Right.
It's not an excuse, but it's a reason. I just found that interesting.
No, I
How similar to Aquinas' philosophy that what you were saying there. It's, I think, something that it's a little bit of wisdom that is of Aquinas's that was so misunderstood over the centuries, but it's just as true now as when he said it and when the Bible elucidated on it.
no, and that's the nature of us as human beings. Yeah, I think there's a point, and I would agree with you that people will lose hope. That they fall so far away from God, they realize, well, there's no way back. And I think that may be the basis for atheism, is the idea that, not that, I don't believe in a God because I think it's unrealistic, but I don't believe in a God because I don't want to be held accountable, because I feel if I do that, if I acknowledge that there is a God who has a moral purpose for the universe, that I haven't lived up to it. And in fact, I've fallen so far that there's, in my opinion, or in my emotions, I believe I can never get back. Therefore, the heck with it, and I'm just not going to care anymore. That's where you get people with, I guess, what I've heard called seared consciousness. They
Yeah.
just they just don't feel anymore because they don't want to. Because if they did, it would be just horribly painful, agonizing. And I think as human
There's
beings, we have. Oh, go ahead.
no. Go ahead first.
I was just,
You're
as
the
human
guest.
I think as human beings that we all have that potential. I mean, we all tend to do that, my perspective at least. That well,
We agree, and it maybe not in the same words, but we agree in the spirit of it. At a certain point, you just
Yes.
don't have a
yeah,
conscience anymore, or at least a
right,
conscience in the same way that we
So
would think.
right,
yeah, there
and
was this brilliant scene in I thought I was brilliant anyway in the Netflix show Daredevil, which
okay,
was an adaptation of the Marvel comic character, and
hmm,
he is famously Catholic. Frank
right,
Miller, in his run on Daredevil, really leaned into this in his brilliant story, Born Again. And the Netflix show likes to play this up. Catholic is always good for television because all of the symbols are very visually striking.
right,
Uh,
and everybody believes on television that the only version of Christianity is Catholicism, and so it's
yeah, that's true
accessible
too.
that way.
That's true too. So Daredevil, and in the comics, he really is canonically Catholic. This is actually
Hmm.
like a thing with him. So they
Right.
could have some fun with the visuals and things like that, and a lot of good moral type writing. Well, one scene that I thought was brilliant, Daredevil, as Matt Murdock, has a conversation with his priest, Father Lantham, who was my favorite character in the show. And as he's sitting and having the conversation, he says, "Father, do you believe in the devil?" And he goes, it's funny that you asked me that. He goes, "Because as a young priest, I would have told you no. I would have said the devil was invented by writers, essentially to get people to believe, to listen to them." And he goes, "It's not very Catholic of you." And he goes, "So you don't believe in the devil?" He goes, "Was I finished yet?" He goes, "No, that's not what I said." He goes, "Well, then I had to volunteer in Africa." He goes, "And there was a warlord who was going around and he was massacring people. And he wanted to kill like the leader of the village as an example. And this guy had a family and he was beloved by everybody there, including by me." Goes, "So everybody pleaded with him. I went out there and I pleaded with him directly. I offered myself in his place." I forget exactly what he said, but it was something along those lines, right? We all pleaded with him. We begged him not to. He goes, "So he pulls the leader of the village out, and then in front of his family, takes out a machete. He hacks him to pieces in front of everybody." He goes, "So yes, I believe in the devil."
Yeah.
And I thought that was such a brilliant scene because that's the sort of thing I think about. Like those people, 100% they exist. They exist right now. They exist all over the world. Do you think that that person was thinking to himself that he was the hero of the story? I don't think he thought of himself as either the hero or the villain. I don't think he cared. I think he was I think he was the hero in the sense that he was the main character, so whatever he did was okay. And that includes massacring this person because everybody needed to obey him. And if you had asked him, if you had tried to reason with him about it, I just think he literally wouldn't have cared. It wouldn't have meant a thing to him. Uh, it's a wonderful scene, and the show is pretty good. I don't recommend you pay for Netflix because Netflix is evil. But if you ever get a chance to sail the seven seas for it, it might be worth a watch, depending on your tolerance for superhero shows. I know
No.
that people have varying levels of that nowadays, with
Yeah.
good reason.
No, I've heard very good things about the show, and I philosophically I just won't pay for a streaming service because, I'm paying for this service that I would watch one, maybe two shows or whatever. And but yeah, like I said, I'm a very old school Marvel and DC fan, and so I remember Daredevil when he had his yellow suit way back in the day
Yeah,
before Wally Wood actually reinvented him in Daredevil 7. But
yeah.
yeah.
The old Stan Lee Daredevil. When I reread his first comic years ago and reviewed it actually, and I was surprised at how bad it was, which sounds mean. Um, the artwork. So let me clarify here. The artwork was actually terrific, better than modern day artwork. Clearly, more detailed, more
hmm
just all around superior. The writing was quite poor. It was clearly a Spider-Man ripoff, and
hmm
they advertised this fact very prominently because all over the comic were advertisements from the creator
Spider-Man.
of Spider-Man, and
hmm
like
Yeah,
all over the comic.
I remember
So
that.
Frank Miller took over the comic, and he took over the comic when it was a lemon. And this is
hmm
actually fairly, you'll hear this with some of the big names in the industry. I don't think Miller was the only one. He essentially took the comic as a challenge because it was being released bi-monthly and they were
hmm
on the verge of canceling it. And he
hmm
said, the reason I wanted to take Daredevil is because his superpower was being blind, and that was entertaining to me, uh, which I think is pretty funny. And he decided he basically reinvented the character. I know you
hmm
mentioned Wally Wood, you said,
Yeah.
and you're right. Other writers, like all the elements that became Daredevil were there before Miller, but Miller was the person who kind of got the recipe right, I guess. Like he put him
hmm
in the right quantities and emphasized the right things. So he made Daredevil's Catholicism, which had already technically been established, he made it like a core part of Daredevil's character. And according to Miller, he said only a Catholic could be both a lawyer and a vigilante, uh, which is a great line.
hmm
And he really put an emphasis on like the Catholic philosophical elements. He
hmm
changed Daredevil's backstory a lot. He added Stick to the backstory, which I think was the correct move, and he made it so that Matt lost his eyesight as a child instead of as a teenager, which I also think was the correct move. He really emphasized like the moral ambiguity of Matt's father's death and, you know, what that meant for Matt and how that inspired him. Again, all things I think were absolutely correct. And he totally turned around, like he turned around Daredevil almost instantly. This was a comic that was released bi-monthly, and within like 6 months it was being released monthly, and was, instead of on the verge of cancellation, was one of Marvel's bestsellers. So, you know, he came back to that run many years later. But yeah, it was for Daredevil Born Again, which is absolutely my favorite comic story ever. I adore Daredevil Born Again. And I think it's interesting because going back to like the 1960s Daredevil and reading that first issue, like that Daredevil is a very different character than the Frank Miller Daredevil.
It's like the Edgar Rice Burroughs stories. I mean, when you go back to the early 1960s, you're talking about writing that was meant to appeal to 10 to 12-year-old boys. It was very simple. It was very adventure, but these characters were literally two-dimensional. And at the time, we didn't mind because we were kids and it was fun. But when you evolve forward, when you develop, you go into the 1980s, especially, and going forward, the readers were older. They were at least college age, a lot of them, and so you had to appeal to individuals that expected more depth. And so let's make Matt Murdock a real person as opposed to just some guy jumping around in a costume. And I think that's and you're right. I think Miller made an incredibly correct decision in creating a fully developed religious Daredevil who would have enormous conflicts with, you know, who he was as a Catholic versus going around and beating up people with his bare hands.
There's a
Where is
Catholic
where is
tradition of
justice?
that with Arius.
There is.
Well, okay.
Saint Nicholas and Arius.
Okay. Yeah, you have an experience because I'm not Catholic. I am a Christian, but I don't have a Catholic. I don't have a Catholic background to draw from.
So it was a heretic that Saint
It's
Nick
a joke, yeah.
Slapped in front of Emperor Constantine for being a persistent heretic. It's just one of those like funny little stories we tell ourselves. You know, how should we deal with this? Well,
according
you know,
to legend,
Saint Nick.
Nicholas at the Council of Nicaea punched the heretic Arius in the face.
Okay, I hadn't heard that one, but I believe you. But
fun story.
Yeah, well, it's the whole idea
It's
of
also probably
what do we
true,
do?
but...
What do we do as children of God when we're faced with injustice? I mean, at a certain level, you know, where do we seek peace, and at some point, where do we not? Because we can't. I mean, even Jesus through
it's worth noting
money
that
changers.
the story is probably not true, but
okay, but we do have a biblical story of Jesus throwing the money changers out of the temple because they were cheating people. You know, it's not meek and mild Jesus. It's like, I'm getting a whip and I'm kicking you all out.
Right, you've turned my father's house into a house of
thieves.
Yep.
Quoting Elijah, I think. But yeah, so you do have a precedence for the idea that in the name of justice that, you know, we can basically go in there and be Daredevil. So
didn't Peter murder a magician? I call it murder to be shocking.
I don't think I don't. I'm trying to remember. He challenged a magician who was basically wrongly invoking the name of Christ and wanted to actually pay for the ability to create miracles. I don't think he killed him. I
recall the magician dropping dead, but I might.
Okay, that's a different. But okay, people drop dead because of God had invoked justice. I don't think that Peter literally, like, you know, I'm going to kill you. But there were people who did die because they were being unjust, and God delivered justice upon them. Whether a person was, you know, like Peter was used as an instrument or not, but it was an act of the Almighty, not of a self-righteous individual. So, well, I appreciate the time that you gentlemen have given me. Thank you very much. And we've, you know, probably gone far field, but it's been an enjoyable conversation.
Absolutely. And it's been very enjoyable to have you on, James.
Thank you.
I
I
will
appreciate that.
cut us off shortly, but I do recommend people check out Ice. That's besides the Soul Anthology. That's certainly my favorite of your new things that have been published since the
Well,
last
thank you.
time you were on. Certainly for the cover alone, certainly because it just sounds interesting. Um,
Well, yeah, thank you. I appreciate that.
before you go, is there anything coming up we should know about?
Um, Unfortunately, nothing I can really talk about. Well, um, the Cloak Press anthology, Winter of Wonder, has my latest story, That Which Burns, which is basically it probably is most correctly qualified as horror, but it involves a fire starter, and again, this struggle with how you're treated versus how you respond to that.
Mm-hmm.
It's also a Christmas story, which is very
Ooh,
interesting. Um, and there's another one that has been accepted for publication, but I haven't been allowed to talk about it in detail yet. It is set in a different shared universe in the Andromeda Galaxy, and it's novella length. It's roughly 2,000 words. So when I get the green signal, so to speak, I'll be glad to let you know where you can pick it up.
please. I am working on some ways to get more cross promotion across Superversive and Christian and all these other types of authors, because there's
Hmm.
a lot of shall we say islands going on, and it's time
Yeah.
to sort of mix it into an archipelago. Uh,
Okay. That sounds great.
Other people are waiting on me, therefore, James, I will thank you once again for coming on, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
You
Uh,
too.
Thank you guys for listening. Thank you, Anthony, for being patient. And I hope you'll join us next week. Merry Christmas, all.
Merry Christmas to you. Take care now.
Mhm.
Bye bye.